Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. This is our 25th year. Each month, we share firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self-identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our conversation, please send us your questions and let us know where you are joining from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Theodora Kleiman share her firsthand account of survival with us. Dora, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Dora, we have a great deal to cover in a short period, so we'll start right away. Dora, you were born January 31st, 1938 in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, which is in present-day Croatia. Before we turn to World War II and the Holocaust, please tell us about your parents, Solomon and Silva.
Well, it's lovely to see them in the photo that was taken at their wedding. And first, to tell you about my father's family, my father was actually born in Romania, and then they went across Serbia and eventually settled in Zagreb. And as an adult, my father had started a small factory. He had learned how to make brushes, and he had started a small workshop, small factory of brushes. And he lived there with his mother. His father had passed away by that time, and five siblings. So he, as the rest of the male members of that family, all learned a lot about the Jewish religion, and they were an Orthodox family, Orthodox religious family. And my father was able to conduct services for Jewish ceremonies, Jewish services in temples. And so I think he went to visit and actually conduct services in a town where my mother lived at that time. So my mother's family was not in Zagreb. They were living in a small town. They were living in a small town of Ludbreg, north of Zagreb. And my grandfather was a rabbi in that town. He came there with two children and then had two more children, my mother, who was born there. And he was the rabbi of that town for some 40 years before the war happened. This picture is of my parents 2 years after they were married. So this is now probably 1940, and I look sort of to be 2 years old. And this picture is taken in Zagreb because once they married, they went to Zagreb. My mother had been an elementary school teacher, but at this point she was not teaching. She had yours truly to take care of, and they were here in Zagreb in front of the zoo. Maksimir, we called it.
That is a very striking photo. I'm glad we were able to show that one. You spent a lot of time, though, in your mother's hometown of Ludbreg and eventually would spend the war years there. Will you tell us what was unique about Ludbreg?
Well, it was a small town, and in a sort of a totally rural area, settled sort of between two larger towns of Koprivnica and Varaždin, and it was peaceful and the Jewish community, which was small but coexisted very peacefully with their Catholic neighbors. It was a totally Catholic world, pretty much. Um, and my grandfather would conduct services and also served as apparently as a member of the middle school faculty at one point. So you see a picture of my grandfather to the left, and there is a priest at the other end. And I like that photo because it gives me an idea that, in fact, they were coexisting peacefully in that world. So my grandfather was able to teach Judaism to the Jewish children, and the rest of the population would be more aligned with the Catholic Church in that world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you described, that photo really is symbolic of what it was like at the time in Ludbreg. So thank you for sharing that. Did you have a large extended family, Dora?
In Ludbreg, yes. In Ludbreg, my mother, as I said, they had my grandparents had 4 children, and so one of the other daughters stayed in Ludbreg, was married. They had 2 children, and of course, they were very much a close-knit family. One son went off to Zagreb and eventually married and stayed there, but the other sister who was also in Ludbreg and who played a very important role in my life later on was my Aunt Giza, and she was 15 years older than my mother. And eventually married someone who was 10 years older than she. So this was a couple that played a large role in my life later on.
And your Aunt Giza, and of course, was married to your uncle Ludovic, or as you knew him as Ludva, and they would play a very important role in your survival, and we'll hear more about that later. Tell us a little bit more about them in this picture, if you don't mind.
Well, this picture is sort of symbolic of who he was. This is an old house that they lived in, and basically was his parents' house. And he grew up in this house, and he was played a lot of different roles in Ludbreg. He was at one point a mayor, and he was director of the bank, and he was instrumental in putting together a little orchestra. He played a classical violin, and also he had this car which he was very proud of. Apparently, it was only the 3rd car that reached Croatia. It was a Lancia. He always talked about it, and had a dog there. It's on the front. But Aunt Giza, as I said, was 10 years younger than he, and she worked in the bank, and that's how they got to know each other. And they were very much in love, but it took a long time before they actually married. And he used to tell me later on that, he was happy living with his mother, who was still alive, and she with her parents. I didn't exactly believe it once he was telling me that, because I know they were very much in love, and here you see them being very happy on an outing to a place of vacation with other people present. But it took until 1939 before they actually marry. I think we talked about that some later on, right?
Yeah, and I think their marriage was right after the war began in Europe in the beginning of September 1939. Before we go on, Dora, I'd like to let you know that we have people listening to you today and watching from all over the place. We have folks tuning in from around the country in Minnesota, New York, Maine, Florida, and California. And we have people viewing you from around the world. We have people today in Poland, Chile, Scotland, Malta, and Croatia. And I also want to share a comment from a viewer named Joe. Joe writes, Dora, thank you. And as a descendant of Yugoslavs myself, I look forward to hearing more of your story. I hope to share it with my students who I know are equally appreciative.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
It's very nice.
World War II would not reach you until Nazi Germany and its allies invaded Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941. You were just 3 years old at the time and away from Zagreb on a visit with relatives in Ludbreg. Please tell us what you can about why you were away from your parents and what happened after the invasion.
So I'm not sure why I was away at my grandparents'. I suppose it was a lovely visit that I was supposed to go on. There were the neighbors of ours that came, neighbors of my grandparents that came, and it was an opportunity for my parents to send me. But I think probably they sent me for a reason that by that time I had a little brother. My brother was born in January of 1931. It was exactly almost to the day 3 years younger than I. And probably my mother found it useful to send me away to my grandparents. Of course, I had no idea that that would be the last time I would actually see my parents. But I arrived to my grandparents, and I just was very happy spending time there.
And that was your brother Stratko.
And that was my brother
Stratko. Once Germany attacked, the Ustasha took control of part of Yugoslavia. Will you tell us a little about the Ustasha?
That's quite a story, because it's really a political machinations on their part. They were a very right-wing organization within Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia at that time was a fairly new country, but it did not exist until after World War I, and it was kind of cobbled together by all the parts that eventually created Yugoslavia. So Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, Montenegro, all of them were now a Yugoslavia. And they were trying to cobble together a government and find a way to govern. And it wasn't easy at all. The Croatian right wing did not want to have this kind of a cooperation. They wanted to have an independent state. And so when they were unable to achieve that politically, they went to Italy, which was already fascist, run by Mussolini, and they prepared to attack. They made a pact with Hitler. Pavelic, the head of the group, made a pact with Hitler, and basically said, when you attacked, and they knew that eventually Germany would attack, then we will govern the country for you. We will do everything you want to do, but we will run the country. And so they did. And this country that they created at the time after the attack was to be called Independent State of Croatia, Nezavisna Država Hrvatska. And of course, it was not nezavisna, it was not independent, it was a puppet government of Germany.
And with the Ustasha now in control of Croatia, the government began targeting Jews. Will you tell us about the anti-Semitic policies that were put in place then?
Well, everything that Germany propagated in every country they attacked was now to be in power in Croatia. So that meant that all the Nuremberg laws were to be adhered to. And that meant, of course, confiscation of all property and lack of all civil rights, inability to go to the university or to have proper employment. And everybody had to wear an identifying mark. And the identifying mark was the one that you can see in front of you in this picture. This is again a picture of my parents and one of my aunts and cousins, and they're all wearing a badge, which you had to wear at all times. And the badge says, it has a Star of David and it has a letter J. It's a Z with an inverted little marker, a diacritical mark. And it's J says Židov, which means Jew. So they had to be identified wearing this identifying mark at all times. I find it very interesting to see this picture because, of course, it's black and white, except for the badges, which the photographer colored yellow. Why he did that, I still don't know. Whether it was to make sure that they do not forget who they are, or was it an act of anger or of compliance? I don't know.
But it's profound. Any whatever the motivation was, and incredibly symbolic to see that here.
Yes.
What happened to your parents and brother who were still in Zagreb?
Well, I was still in Ludbreg, and they were still in Zagreb, and the deportation started very soon after the start of the so-called independent state of Croatia, and the deportation started to the camps, and my parents were picked up and were waiting someplace in a transit space to get on the trains and be deported. Not as some people might think, to places like camps that we know, like Auschwitz and so on. No, but to a camp by the name of Jasenovac. We'll talk about that more.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, my mother had my baby brother with her, and it was very fortunate for him that our housekeeper went to this transit camp and asked if she can have the baby, my baby brother. And I am sure it was horrendous effort on my mother's part and very sad, but she understood that it was for his well-being. So she handed my baby brother to the housekeeper. And she then notified my uncle, my Catholic uncle Ludva, and his wife in Ludbreg, and they came and got him. And I have this memory of his arrival to where I was, which was I was still at my grandparents' house, and I remember, because there he was as all of a sudden a baby, and I hadn't seen him for a while because I'd been now months already in Ludbreg. This picture is, of course, he's quite a bit older already, and this was summertime, and I seem to have a pretty good time there. We sort of lived normal life for a while with whatever relatives were still there.
I want to pause on that for just a moment, Dora. So just to kind of summarize, your parents were arrested, taken to this transit camp, and the housekeeper was able to get Stravko and get Stravko to you. So now it's you and your little infant brother without your parents at that time. Is moving on from there, in 1942, roundups began in Ludbreg, and most of your extended family was arrested at that time. Can you tell us what you remember about your family, other family members being taken away?
Absolutely. And what happened at that point is my brother and I were now with my Aunt Giza and her Catholic husband, Ludva. And but I have a very vivid memory of my grandparents and my aunts, my Aunt Blanca and my cousins coming to our house to say goodbye, and everyone was crying and hugging, and carrying satchels. And I sort of remember somebody carrying a pillow. I don't know whether it was a pillow or just a, um, a, a pillowcase filled with other things.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea why they were all crying, but of course they were being deported to Jasenovac, the camp.
And those are memories that you continue to have to this day from that
Yeah,
experience.
yeah.
Wow. And Dora, Jews were not the only group targeted by the Ustasha. Will you tell us about other communities and that were targeted by them and what happened to them?
Yes, as I was mentioning before, the Ustasha had the political idea of what we now call ethnic cleansing. They wanted to be rid of any Serbs that might have lived within what was Croatia, and so the idea was to deport them and basically kill them. And this picture is of a convoy uh, of people from a Serb village, and there are two Ustasha guards who are armed and are now leading them all out of their houses, out of their homes, and to Jasenovac, where they were summarily killed, most of them. The same thing happened to Roma. So the Jews were not alone, but they were just the the extra people that the Germans imposed in a way to be also killed. The Croats, the Ustasha, had the idea of getting rid of the Serb population.
Dora, one of the things you noted to me in that photograph was one of the Ustasha guards smiling there in the foreground.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
having a good time.
Dora, how did you and your brother and your Aunt Giza at that time avoid arrest?
Um, well, we we were trying to keep as quiet and as out of sight as possible, and of course we were being sheltered by my Aunt Giza's Catholic husband. Um, and this was a this it's obvious that the the population of Ulbreg knew who we were. I mean, we were the rabbi's family. We were my brother and I were the rabbi's grandchildren. One and
Mhm.
only rabbi. Don't imagine this was a huge place. This was a small place with small number of Jews with one synagogue, one small synagogue, and so everybody knew who we were. So we tried to stay out of the way um, and hide when we needed to. Um, Often this place was subject to attacks by the partisans, and this is another story that not everybody in that world was, by any stretch of the imagination, was happy with the Ustasha and their uh, functioning or malfunctioning, and so they in fact and joined the partisan force and fought the Ustasha.
Mhm. Before we go on, Dora, I'd like to remind our audience to please share any questions that you have in the chat for Dora. So please do that if you can. Dora, your uncle Ludva was arrested in 1943 and sent to the Ustasha-run Jasenovac concentration camp. Why was your uncle, who was Croatian and Catholic, why was he imprisoned?
As I just mentioned, a lot of people did not want to go along with the Ustasha, and they went into the mountains and on the forests and joined and became a fighting force. This was originally the original core was the people who I think many people know of Tito and that group, and it was a sort of a opposite the left wing political entity, and they had been sort of trained in Soviet Union, to some of them at that time, or before, I mean before the war. And so this partisans, who were now sort of an established force in the around our area, they would attack Ludbreg, and then Osterse would fight them, and we lived through many of these fights, and sometimes there were times we were actually liberated. Ludbreg was liberated. But when the Osterse came back, they felt that there must have been somebody or someone who was responsible for their having lost the fight, and at that time, and so they created a sort of they decided on a revenge, and the revenge included taking some 5 people who were sort of leaders of the Ludbreg community, and the Jews were all gone by then, but the Ludbreg community, and send them to Jasenovac. And among them was my uncle Ludva. So he had, as I said, he had been a very prominent member of that community. And so he was given a sentence. And that was a difference between being a Jew or being a Catholic, a Croatian Catholic. They were actually given sentences of a certain amount of time, but he was sent to the same place, to the same camp. So he was sent also to the camp of Jasenovac.
And that's a very significant difference, a sentence, because it connotes a beginning and an end of a sentence, whereas for Jews, and it sounds like from Serbs, there was no sentence. It was
no sentence.
It was a death sentence.
Yeah. You just either survive through all of that, or you just die, or you get killed.
Yeah. Dora, I think most of us have probably never heard of Jasenovac, and that was certainly true of me until I met you. And you've told me that it was an especially violent camp. What more can you tell us about Jasenovac?
It was a horrendous camp in that there was it was a killing camp, and some of the killing happened with with the usual things that we think about, like hanging or shooting, but some of it was just even more primitive. So that I was told by witnesses that my grandfather, who was quite elderly already at the time, never made it through the gate. At the gate, one of the Osterse just took a shovel and hit him on the head, and that was how he was killed. It's very sad. So it was a camp where there was barely any food, rampant disease, a horror. Here is a picture of some of the entry times, where you can see the Osterse guards going through the people's clothing and taking any kind of possessions that was valuable in any way. They also took like a winter coat they would take, because people had to suffer through horrible cold and rain, and it's a very damp area. It's near the river. It was very tough.
Yeah. Before we go on, Dora, I would like to let you know that not only do we have viewers in Zagreb, Croatia, we have one today in Ludbreg. And we also have a classroom watching at Parkview Middle School in Cranston, Rhode Island. And so hello to all of you who are watching, and particularly to our viewer who's in Ludbreg.
Yeah. Thank you.
What do you know about your uncle's time at Jasenovac?
Well, he was very, very lucky, because if you think about my father, who apparently had to work in a tannery. They had set up a tannery, and that was very hard work, and they had almost no food. And all the testimonies from Jasenovac at the time speak to lack of food, exposure to the elements, and so on. My uncle Ludva was very lucky in that they knew that he was a banker. and they needed, it was a horrible place where it was total disorder, and they needed somebody to work on their on their accounts. So they put him in an office. So he was out of the elements most of the time. And there was one person in that camp, in his office, that was actually very kind to him. So between these two things, and also they found out that he had organized a musical events in Lulbreg, and they wanted to have a musical event to be entertained. So they put him to organize such a thing, and so he would then collect everybody he could so that they could have respite for a few hours while they, in quote, practice for this musical event. So he that was very lucky, because he came from a family of many children, and they practically all died. Not practically, they all died young. Well, it is practically one sister survived to old age, but nobody else. And so he also had very sensitive lungs. He would have never survived if he had to work the way my father did.
And and on top of that, he was not a young man at that time. I think he'd been born in the late
Right.
19th century.
He was born in 1885, so he
1885, yeah.
was quite a bit older than my father or my mother. Yeah.
You shared with me that your uncle, while he was at Jasenovac, actually came across your father.
Oh yes, yes. He saw my father, and so when he eventually returned, which was very lucky, he could bring us news of my father, and he was still alive. Yes.
Do you know if your Aunt Giza was able to be in touch with your uncle while he was in the camp?
Yes, and that was very lucky. And one thing, I don't know whether we talked about it before, she actually had the, I don't know, chutzpah, I think, the to actually write a letter to Poglavnik, to the head of the Ustasha, demanding that he be released from camp. But that was one thing. But she also was able to send packages. And so one of the things that she was able to send is this picture. This, of course, is another copy, but this is a picture of my Aunt Giza and my brother and me. And this is a picture we sent to my uncle to Jasenovac. We also were able to send some food. And one item of food that I remember very well that she used to make was, like, she would take fat and then a lot of flour, and she would make this what we call roux in cooking, and she would make a paste, and then make it so thick that she could create a sort of a brick, and she would wrap that up and send it. Now that sounds very strange, but actually the reason that was a useful item is that you could take a small amount of that, like, a walnut size amount of that, and put it in what was passing for soup, and you would have something that had caloric value that would sustain you.
And as you had explained to me at another time, but it looked very unappealing. And so as the guards were pilfering, taking what they wanted, that probably was something that they didn't touch, and it got to,
Yes, exactly.
your uncle. Yeah.
And something like an apple, they would have just eaten it. But
Right.
yeah, but this was sort of like not very appealing. Yes.
In early 1943, your Aunt Giza was turned into the authorities for being Jewish, and she was deported. What can you tell us about what happened to your Aunt Giza, and who you and your brother were then able to stay with in Lüdebreg?
That was terrible. As I said, Lüdebreg was unusual in that people knew who we were, but they didn't give us up. But at one point, there is a guy by the name of Tramshik who reported that there was a Jewish woman living in this house. And so somehow she heard that they were coming to get her, and she grabbed my brother and me. And I have this image of her running with us to our neighbors. Our neighbors lived in the house next door in a small apartment. This is a family Runyak, and they had three children of their own, and they were not well to do. Mrs. Runyak was a nurse, and she was particularly taking care of people's eyes, and trachoma was prevalent, and her husband was a house painter, so they didn't have a lot, but they took us in. They took us in, and not only did they take us in, but they taught us how to survive there, because the Usashi actually bivouacked in our big backyard. In the two houses were connected by, they had a common backyard, and so there they were, and we were taught by Mrs. Runyak, we were told by Mrs. Runyak that if there is anybody that comes into the house that we didn't know, we were to call her mom. And my brother called her mom to the end of his life, which unfortunately was, he died very young. But I was already old enough. I understood danger and when it was not dangerous. So I would call her mom when someone was there. But when they left, she was Mrs. Runyak for me.
That's remarkable in a way, though, that at such a young age that you had the instincts to be able to discriminate between when it was necessary and not necessary.
Though I don't have a real sense of that, but I think I must have had a sense of danger.
Yeah.
What was dangerous and what was not, because I remember distinctly that I would go back and forth like that.
Dora, when the Ustasha came and took your Aunt Giza, why do you think they didn't take you and your brother?
I really don't know. I think they weren't totally aware of us, especially the time when everybody was being taken away and my uncle was still there. But I think it was, there was one possibility they didn't want to be bothered with small children, but that's not that likely. I think more likely it is that we were not on the list of Jews of Ludbreg, because about it, we came from Zagreb, and when they first came into power, the one thing they would always demand, the police always knew who was living where, and they demanded the list of the Jews of the era of Ludbreg. And we have actually a list of Ludbreg Jews at that time and who was to be deported, and we were not on the list because we came from Zagreb, and so we were not part of that list.
So that may explain why they didn't take you, because you weren't on the list, as you said.
It's possible.
We have a viewer named Eileen who's watching, and she has a question. She asks, what was your understanding at that time of where your parents were?
I don't think I had an understanding of where they were. I just possibly I just thought they were where I left them at home. I don't think anybody told me anything about the camps. I don't remember people telling me about the camps or if of deportations. I probably didn't ask much because I was still with someone that I loved when I was with my Aunt Giza. Of course, when I was with the Runyak family, I mean, they were very kind to me and my brother. But I don't think I was asking questions particularly.
And again, you're just a young child. Dora, your uncle Ludva was released from Jasenovac and was surprised to find that Giza had been deported.
Right.
Tell us what he did when he learned what had happened to her.
Well, first he tried to follow the trail. He went to Zagreb and he tried to see if he can find out where she was deported, and he was told that she was not deported to Jasenovac. She was deported to Auschwitz, and that is correct, because actually right now we have We have records of it. The from Bad Arolsen records that were collected by the Germans. We have a record of her arrival to Auschwitz and to her to her death very soon afterwards, supposedly of intestinal illnesses or whatever. So he could not do anything. So he returned and then took us from the Runyak family to his ancestral home, which was right next door, and that's how we continued to live.
And during that time, you and your brother were baptized as Christians, and why was that?
As Catholic, to be precise. Yeah, because this is a Catholic world. Well, Mrs. Runyak was told by that local priest who was aware who we were. And he said at one point, as reported by her daughter fairly recently to me, just very few years, much after the war, that he said to her, and what are we going to do with these children? Like, so this is going to be, they're going to be next to go. And she thought that it might be useful if we were to be baptized. So we were. So in 1944, my brother and I were baptized.
Dora, do you know, once you were with your Uncle Ludva and went back, as you said, to the ancestral home, where you would remain with him until the end of the war, do you have any idea what it was like for him to care for you and your brother at that time, and also to cope with the loss of his wife? And
must have been horrendous, though. As a child, I'm not sure that I was totally aware of how difficult it was, and to what extent he, really spent all his effort and his love to protect us and to make sure that that we were spared. That's why I wasn't told very much, because it was like, kind of like, oh yeah, it's going to all be fine, and just go eat your food or whatever. It was not really discussed very much. But and of course we were dealing with the partisans attacking the town, and the Ustashi still being there, and mostly we were worried about being killed by sniper fire, or by, actually, I shouldn't even call it sniper fire. It was just, fights, gunfights, and we used to hide, and sometimes we hid in the basement it was not an American style basement. It was a cellar that was used for storing barrels of wine. We had a vineyard, and the wine would be down there, and maybe also some, apples and carrots and things like that were kept in cold. And it was a place with a dirt floor, and we had some kind of cots. And sometimes, if we knew that there would be fights, we would be there for many, many nights. And in the morning, you would peer through the small windows on top, and you try to figure out who was in charge. If the partisans won, then we were okay. But if the Ustashi were in charge, then it was, of course, dangerous, and we would try to stay out of sight. For me, it meant often that if I wanted to go out, I'd have to wear a hat on my head, and so did my brother, because and I'm talking about hat that hid my hair, because in those days I was a bright redhead. Both of my brother and I, we were bright redheads, and that's unusual for Croatia. So I would stand out. We would stand out. So we were told to stay in the house or wear a hat if we went out, even in the summertime. it was annoying, but I was told that was just necessary because I don't know how they explained it to me, frankly, that was necessary.
Dora, you shared with me that either looking outside or on those few occasions you went outside, you witnessed, you saw really horrific things.
Yes, I do remember being taken by one of our. We had housekeepers. My uncle couldn't, do the cooking and taking care of two children by himself. So we had housekeepers and maids, and one of them once took me to a movie house, and I very much wanted to go. I remember, and so she said, "Okay, okay." So she took me, but she was, as we were approaching the main square, she was holding her hand over my eyes, and but I could peer out anyway, peek between her fingers. And this was a horrible scene because um, every tree, and there were many trees on the main square, all around the square. From every tree, there was at least one person hanging. Um, they and I can't even now remember whether it was the. I think it was the partisans that were hanging. That they was she did that.
Tell us about the bullet that struck the spot where your uncle had been before he came to comfort you in one night.
Oh yes, that was a horrible night when there was another fight, and the bullets were flying from across the street. Um, and of course, we were in this very old house with very thick walls, so the bullets couldn't go through the walls. But there were many windows, and the bullets could go through the windows. And we did not at that time. We didn't have the time to go and hide in the cellar, and so we were stuck in the house. And I was in a corner, like a safe corner where there were no windows, crying. And my uncle came to comfort me. And when he got up from where he had been and come to comfort me, a bullet flew in through the window and hit exactly where he had been a second before. So, in some ways, I remember saving his life. It was horrible. And at the time, we just were shaken. But
You've described, the fighting was constant. It was back and forth. That bullets were coming through the windows. I remember you telling me like your armoire was peppered with bullet holes, and you said that for you the worst part of that time was living through battles and being afraid of being shot rather than of being taken away or deported somewhere else. I can only imagine that for a small child, the thought of getting shot like that would have been a very, very dramatic and tangible and immediate fear.
yes, definitely. And we saw so many things. Like I remember peering out the window after one of the fights, and when everything was calmed down. And I remember a carts, those horse-drawn carts, being passing our house, and they were full of naked bodies. So the soldiers were killed, and then stripped of their clothing, so someone else could use it, of course, and then they were just dumped someplace. I have no idea where it went.
Mhm. Dora, we have a question from a viewer named Hamina, and
Mhm.
Hamina asks, Dora, what happened to your parents?
Well, my mother, I think, from what people tell me, who sort of had an idea, I think my mother died very soon after getting to Jasenovac, or Starogradiška, the another part of it. I think she died of typhus. But my father survived for a long time. And as I mentioned before, Uncle Ludwig actually saw him,
Mhm.
working hard but surviving. He was young and strong. He was surviving. So at the end of the war, however, when it was clear to the Ustashi that they had lost the war, they tried to destroy Jasenovac. They destroyed a lot of it, and there was a breakout. And in this breakout, a number of people escaped. By the way, my uncle Arnold, another brother of my father's, was also in there. And what happened is that they broke out, and they were running to some safe space, and they found some forested area. Unfortunately, they ran into a German brigade of some sort, some unit, and they were shot.
Mm.
And one person survived, and he's the one who testified to that fact. But my father was killed. So my
Yeah.
father survived the entire time,
Mhm.
escaped, and then was killed.
And then right before the war's end.
Yes.
With the war's end, Dora, in May 1945, you were, of course, alone with your brother and your uncle. What did your Uncle Ludwig do to attempt to resume and try to have some normalcy in life for you and your brother and himself?
Well, we sort of um, pretended that everything was fine, but the what happened was that he, once he knew that my parents weren't going to return, he actually adopted us legally, and we had his last name. Um, then two of my uncles returned, and those two um, returned because they had been serving as prisoners of war in Germany, because they were in the Yugoslav army when Germany attacked, and so they were taken as prisoners of war and they returned. They very soon remarried. The one whose wife was killed remarried. The other one had never married, so he married. Both of them married survivors of the Holocaust. My uncle Bernard married a survivor of Auschwitz, um, and they were going to leave Yugoslavia and go to when they were permitted, and they were going to go to what was then still Palestine and about to become Israel, and they came to Ludbreg. Especially my uncle Bernard Dov, later on was called, to see if they could take my brother and me with them. And they felt that they were the closest family and we should go with them. But at that point, um, I there were problems between my uncle Ludva and them, because both groups wanted to keep me. And I was asked, I think I was age 7, where I wanted to be and where I wanted to go. And I said, I'm staying with my uncle Ludwig, whom of course I loved, and I knew he loved me. And but I'm saying me, because by that time, my brother unfortunately had passed away. He passed away in 1946, very, very fast. He came down with scarlet fever and died like within 3 days. So it was just me, and I voted to stay.
And how, can you say anything about the impact of your brother's death? And it happened not long after Uncle Luva had adopted you. How did that impact your uncle?
Oh, it was devastating to him. I mean, after he had lost his wife, I didn't actually. I maybe I was too young. I saw him suffering, but if after my brother died, I thought he was never going to get over it. It was so depressed. He was so upset.
Mhm.
I think probably possibly because he also blamed the doctor and he blamed himself. Why? How could you die of scarlet fever? But we really didn't have. We didn't. I don't think we had penicillin. Uh, I don't think that they knew how serious it was. The doctor said he had a weak heart, so we didn't go to the nearby town of Varaždin to go to a hospital, and so he died at home.
Hmm. Dora, after that, it was you and your uncle Ludva. You grew up in communist Yugoslavia until you left for university and then came to the United States in the late 1950s. Despite the fact that you lived apart from your uncle Ludva, the two of you remained very close. Will you tell us about your relationship with him and about this amazing photograph?
Well, yes, I went abroad. I went to Switzerland to live for a little bit of time with another surviving uncle, my uncle Yoshi, who survived Bergen-Belsen, and his wife. And on the way, I met an American young man whom I eventually married, and so I came to the United States, and I had two children, and then I was dying to go back and see how my uncle was doing. We had been in contact by mail, but in those days, without phone, without this marvelous internet, which brings us close to people so far away. It was very hard to communicate. But anyway, my husband Dan and my two children, Wanda and Elliot, and I did manage to go. And this probably is the last picture of the two of us together, of my sister Tudor and me together.
It is a beautiful photograph, absolutely. Dora, let's now bring in a video question from Lily, a student from Washington, D.C., to set the scene just a little bit for Lily's question, and we don't have time to discuss this really. You had a long career in the Maryland public school system, so let's hear from Lily.
Hi, my name is Lily, and I'm from Washington, D.C. I know that you worked in the Maryland school system for a really long time, so I was wondering if you brought any lessons from your experience in the Holocaust, if that impacted the way that you taught, any lessons you brought to your students, just surrounding your experience as a teacher who also had this really unique perspective.
Dora, Lily, kind of just to summarize, you heard it. Did you bring any lessons from your experience in the Holocaust to your work as a teacher?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think so, even though I possibly wasn't aware of it. I thought about I didn't think about a Holocaust very much anywhere at that point. It was sort of ingrained in me to take care of people who needed care, just like I was being taken care of by so many during my childhood. So I could have taught French. I actually had a degree in French in high school, but I eventually decided I would teach English as a second language. So it was not just teaching the language, it was teaching how to live in a new country and how to cope with things that children had survived. So I worked with children who had survived the war in Vietnam, the war in El Salvador, the unbelievable change that occurred in Iran at one point. So these children really needed more than just English verbs and nouns. They needed care and understanding, and I was very happy to be able to do that for them.
Thank you, Dora. Our time is very short now, and I do have one more question I want to ask you. But before we close, I want to be sure to acknowledge the news that you just shared with us that your uncle Ludva and the Runyak family were just recognized by Yad Vashem in Israel as, quote, righteous among the nations for their efforts to save you and your brother Zdravko. There was a very moving recognition event in Lübeck just last week that you were able to participate in virtually. I wanted to make sure our audience knew that. Dora, my last question for you. As we face a dangerous surge in anti-Semitism, please tell us why you feel it is important to share your firsthand account of the Holocaust and what people can learn from it.
I just said a minute ago that I didn't think about the Holocaust very much. And I really didn't until I started working in the museum, because an archive came from Jasenovac. And then it struck me what happened there, how fast a country can change from a place where everybody seemed to be happy together to a place where they kill each other. And to what extent it is easy for a country to just switch over, for people to not understand one another, for people to not understand what it leads to, how important it is to have the understanding of history, of political repercussions. And that is what's happening here now, that people, I think, don't remember how easy it is to succumb to propaganda, how easy it is to focus one's thought on, oh, if only these people were not here, if these people would just go someplace else, disappear, then everything would be fine. It doesn't work that way. We all have to work together and understand each other, understand history, understand how easy it is for a democracy to just turn over and become one in which people's lives are lost.
Dora, thank you so much for those closing words for us. Thank you for being an extraordinarily articulate first person today. Thank you. I regret that I didn't have the chance to have you as a teacher. So thank you very much, Dora.
Thank you.
I'd like to take a moment to thank our donor. First Person is made possible through the generous support from the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to invite you to join us next month for another First Person program. Thank you for being with us today.